Why does God allow people to commit crimes? Why doesn't He punish the perpetrators and protect the innocent victims? Today's story will demonstrate a striking example of divine intervention in the life of an ordinary person, or perhaps it's merely a fortunate coincidence. Late in the evening, on November 15th, 1884, a 20-year-old man named John Henry George Lee was assisting his sister Elizabeth in clearing the table in the dining room of an English manor where they both worked. John was the butler, and his sister Elizabeth was the cook. The manor itself was called Glen, and it was located in a beautiful spot on the seacoast in the village of Babbacombe, England. Many years ago, Glen had been much more magnificent. At one point, even the King and Queen of England had come to stay there, but quite recently, the estate and the family who owned it had fallen on hard times. The adult children had moved away, and the head of the household had passed away suddenly. Only the elderly lady of the house remained at the manor. The staff had been reduced to a small team consisting of just the butler John, the cook, his sister Elizabeth, and 2 elderly maids. This meant that virtually all the physical labor fell on the shoulders of John, the only man in the house. That evening they had cleaned up after a dinner party at Glen, to which the lady of the house had invited very important lawyers and politicians. Now, late at night, John was lugging a huge pile of heavy china from the dining room to the kitchen. At the same time, he was trying to talk to his sister, who was also engaged in washing dishes. But the young woman stubbornly pretended not to hear him and simply did not react at all. While John was carrying dozens of plates at a time, Elizabeth was taking and carrying only a few pieces. This irritated the man. Not only was his sister not helping, but she was also ignoring him. This continued until the woman herself approached him. Elizabeth apologized and blamed it on feeling unwell. John noticed his sister instinctively placing her hands on her stomach and realized that she was pregnant. Just a minute ago, John had been about to get angry at her behavior, but now he understood why she had been acting that way. It should be understood that the woman had not told her brother or anyone else in the house about her condition for a reason. The fact was that the owners of Glen were very religious people and held traditional beliefs. Pregnancy out of wedlock was a sin. Elizabeth was not married at the time. In England, it was considered abnormal to have children out of wedlock. It was an absolute taboo. Despite all the woman's efforts to conceal the pregnancy, John and the 2 other elderly maids very quickly realized what was happening, because every morning they heard Elizabeth retching due to morning sickness. They tried to support her in every way, but the woman categorically refused to acknowledge the fact of her pregnancy. Remembering this, John sent his sister to rest, reassuring her that he could handle the dishes on his own. He didn't even know who the father of the future child was, since Elizabeth refused to talk to anyone about it. But neither he nor the 2 other maids wanted the lady of the house to find out about her condition and fire the girl. Friends, over 90% of viewers watch videos without subscribing to the channel. Check if you're subscribed. If not, please be so kind as to subscribe to the channel to support me. By 11 p.m., John had almost finished all his chores and was exhausted. He was about to go to bed when one of the elderly maids entered the kitchen and informed him that it was time for the nightly prayer. The butler put aside the silverware he was polishing without hesitation and followed the maid to the living room, where the owner of Glen was already waiting for them in her nightgown. The mistress, a 68-year-old lady named Emma Keyse, enjoyed conducting nightly prayers with her staff. She felt that in this way she was taking care of the servants and the salvation of their souls. In fact, John was not a very religious man, but to please Emma, he agreed to perform these nightly prayers. The reason for such an arrangement was that the mistress had essentially saved him several times. John had started working for Emma 6 years ago when he was only 14. He was a difficult teenager, a rude troublemaker, but for some reason, the woman had a soft spot for him. John Henry George Lee, the son of a small farmer, was born in 1864 in Abbots Kerswell, a small village in southern England, and getting to Glen was a kind of achievement for him. When John confessed to his mistress that he dreamed of traveling the world, Emma helped him enlist in the British Royal Navy. and for 2 years the young man served in the military and was indeed able to see the world. He dreamed of staying in the service for as long as possible, but one day he caught a very bad cold and fell ill with pneumonia. The illness negatively affected John's health. He was deemed unfit to continue military service and was forced to leave the army prematurely. Upon returning home due to his health condition, John had no idea what to do next. He had planned to stay in the Navy much longer and was now completely at a loss. Due to the weakness that remained after the pneumonia, he could not engage in heavy physical labor in the village and became a burden to his parents. Fortunately, it was at this moment that Emma Keyse intervened. She gave the young man a glowing recommendation, and one of her wealthy friends agreed to hire John Lee as a domestic servant. The young man was immensely happy that he had some purpose in life again, but his happiness was short-lived. Out of stupidity, he made a mistake. He stole an expensive plate from his master. John had not yet figured out what he was going to do with the stolen treasure when the owner of the estate noticed the loss. And he didn't just scold the young man and make him return the item, but involved the police. Ultimately, John Lee ended up in jail for theft, was held behind bars for 6 months, and when he was released, he was sure that now no one would hire him with such a reputation. And again, for the 3rd time, Emma intervened in the young man's fate. This woman believed that people should be forgiven and given a chance to redeem themselves. Otherwise, once a person had stumbled, they could go down the wrong path. The woman, who had recently lost her husband, understood that now positive recommendations would not save John, so she offered him to return to Glen and work for her. She was just in need of a butler at the time. John could not believe it. He knew he did not deserve a second chance, especially from Emma, whom he had let down so badly by stealing an expensive item in her friend's house. From the bottom of his heart, thanking his savior, he swore that he would do everything in his power to make sure she did not regret her decision, and so far everything had been just that. John tried his best to please Emma, and if these nightly prayers with the servants were so important to her, then it was not at all difficult for him to pretend that they brought him joy as well. So that evening, John entered the dining room as usual, sat down next to his mistress, and prepared to perform the daily ritual. After Elizabeth and the 2 other elderly maids had taken their places at the table, everyone joined hands and bowed their heads, and Emma began to recite the prayer. As soon as the event was over, the maids went to the kitchen to prepare a cup of hot cocoa for their mistress. The woman usually went to bed very, very late, when all the other inhabitants of the manor were already asleep. Before going to bed, Emma loved to drink hot cocoa, sitting by the burning fireplace, and read or write letters. She enjoyed being alone with herself. The maids left, and John also wished his mistress good night and walked to the pantry next to the kitchen, which also served as his bedroom. Having made his bed, the young man crawled under the covers and immediately fell asleep, as the fatigue accumulated during the day took its toll. Around 3:30 in the morning, John was awakened by someone's screams. Rubbing his eyes and yawning, he ran out of the pantry and saw that the entire kitchen was filled with smoke. Through the smoke screen, he could make out his sister Elizabeth and one of the maids. They were screaming, calling for his help. It was necessary to urgently evacuate everyone from the premises and at the same time somehow try to extinguish the fire. John instantly rushed upstairs to his mistress's room. He felt that Emma might have encountered problems and wanted to save her. Running up the stairs to the 2nd floor, he ran into the second maid, who looked completely crazy. The woman, sincerely worried, informed the butler that she had just been in the mistress's bedroom and could not find her there. Emma's bed was completely engulfed in flames, so the maid could not see whether the bed was empty or whether the owner of the estate was lying there. Realizing the full horror of the situation, the servants in full force rushed for buckets. Having filled them with water, they rushed to the mistress's bedroom to try to extinguish the fire that was rapidly spreading in Emma's chambers. But by the time they got upstairs, the flames had already spread further and were blocking the entrance to the bedroom like a wall. So there was no way to pass through it, and their small buckets of water were of no help. As much as the servants wanted to save their mistress, they had no choice. Unfortunately, they could do nothing against the raging flames. They had to leave her to perish in the fire. Having made the difficult decision, the four of them turned around and ran downstairs so as not to be burned alive. Running past the dining room on the first floor, the maid and the butler saw Emma lying on the floor. The servants, without even approaching closely, immediately realized from her mutilated body that the mistress was dead, and it was not the fire that was to blame. The terrible wounds on Emma's head indicated that she had clearly been hacked to death. Her neck was cut so deeply that it seemed as if someone had tried to rip her head off. John Lee, Elizabeth, and the two maids just stood there in shock, staring at Emma, not even knowing what to do. Then one of the maids, apparently realizing that a crime had been committed, screamed with all her might and rushed outside. The other inhabitants of the house followed her. Several neighbors, local fishermen, and Coast Guard personnel were able to jointly extinguish the fire at Glen. But it was not just a fire. It was a clear attempt to conceal a brutal murder. When the police arrived at the scene, suspicion immediately fell on John. This story took place long before data obtained from forensic laboratories began to be used in investigations. At that time, due to the lack of concrete evidence, law enforcement officers drew conclusions based on their own reasoning, intuition, inner feelings, and assumptions. The detectives quickly determined that whoever had taken Emma Keyse's life and inflicted those terrible wounds on her must have possessed considerable physical strength. Since John Lee was the only man in the house that night and, accordingly, the strongest, compared to the other female residents of the estate, he must have been the perpetrator. Moreover, a small fresh cut was found on his hand. The police also found bloody footprints under the debris of the burned furniture, indicating that Emma had been attacked not in the living room, but in the corridor near the stairs, which was not far from the pantry where John slept. And a bloody axe and knife were found practically right outside the pantry door. In addition to all this, the investigators established that the fire had been set deliberately. The arsonist had doused the entire house with flammable oil, which was stored in the pantry where John Lee slept. Considering all the evidence found, the butler was arrested on the same day that the fire occurred at Glen Manor, and when the mistress of the house, Emma Keyse, died. Moreover, he already had a criminal record for theft, so, in the opinion of the police, everything pointed to him. The next day, while John Lee was in a prison cell, a warden suddenly appeared at the door and informed him that a lawyer had come to see him. John was confused because he had no means to afford a lawyer and had no idea where one could have come from. Despite the prisoner's bewilderment, the guard opened the cell door and ordered John to proceed to the interrogation room. There, John was met by a well-dressed, respectable man who was sitting at a table and leafing through some papers. The butler was not actually personally acquainted with this man, but he had heard about him and had repeatedly seen him at Glen Manor as a guest. It was just unclear why he had suddenly decided to defend a simple lackey who had nothing to pay him for his efforts. This man's name was Reginald Templar, and he was a very successful lawyer who was highly respected in the area. He also turned out to be one of Emma's closest friends. Why Reginald Templar, a friend of the deceased woman, was going to defend the lackey who was accused of murdering her remained a mystery, both to John and to the prison staff. It simply made no sense. Eventually, Reginald gestured for his client to sit in the chair and asked him to recount everything he remembered about the evening before the tragedy unfolded. Reginald expressed his confidence that the butler had nothing to do with the death of his benefactress. This gave John hope, and feeling some relief, he began to talk about the events of that terrible day. During the conversation, Reginald took notes, clarified some things, and right there began to create the basis for John Lee's defense. Finding himself back in his cell, the butler felt an incredible surge of energy. With Reginald's help, he really had a chance to be saved from the baseless accusation. However, John's relief was short-lived. The first court appearance went great. Reginald appeared in his fashionable suit, confident in himself, and tore the prosecution's case to shreds. Reginald pointed out to the prosecutor that all the evidence was circumstantial and literally far-fetched. John didn't understand much of what his lawyer was saying. All these legal precedents that the lawyer was discussing were far from the things John was used to, but he could see that the judge was impressed. Reginald said that the police had done a terrible job of investigating the crime, making overly hasty conclusions. The prosecutor looked very nervous at that moment, and John was already genuinely feeling confident about his imminent release. Further court proceedings were postponed. If it had continued in the same rhythm as the first one, it is possible that John would have been released right in the courtroom. But on the second day, Reginald simply did not appear in court without any explanation and did not attempt to contact anyone. John Lee, not understanding what had happened, just sat and waited. He didn't know what the judge did in such cases, and the judge, as best he could, postponed the start of the session, then threw up his hands, looked at John, and said that he was very sorry, but now the defendant would have to defend himself on his own. The clerk announced the start of the trial. Of course, John Lee was not ready for such a turn of events. Not only had he never studied law, he hadn't even gone to school. Therefore, from the second day of the trial, things only got worse for the butler, because Reginald continued to miss sessions without any explanation. And if he did appear in court, he would start unnecessary debates with the prosecutor and the judge over issues completely unrelated to the case, which only increased suspicion against John Lee. He was no longer the astute lawyer, but behaved like some kind of maniac. For example, reprimanding the judge about his hairstyle, but not wanting to discuss the real case at all. During the testimony of witnesses, Reginald also behaved strangely. Instead of asking questions on the merits, Reginald was interested in what they had for breakfast or what their favorite color was. The line of questioning made absolutely no sense. Eventually, Reginald simply abandoned the case, leaving John without any defense at all. Although, by general admission, he did him a favor with this act, since another lawyer, upon learning about this, felt sorry for John Lee and volunteered to represent the butler's interests in court. Given that the new lawyer didn't even have time to properly prepare for the trial, his good intentions could not save the defendant from a guilty verdict. Due to the lack of experience, the lawyer was unable to win the case. The jury, having heard the witnesses, the prosecutor, and the defense, went to deliberate. It took them less than an hour to come to a unanimous decision and return with a verdict: guilty. John Henry George Lee was sentenced to death by hanging. For the next 3 months, the butler spent his time in a prison cell, terrified, awaiting execution. All this time, he insisted on his innocence and shouted that God would protect him from an unjust sentence. Finally, on February 23, 1885, the day of John's execution arrived. For most people, it was just an ordinary day, except that the execution never took place. The executioner, a man named James Barry, had sent criminals to the other world for many years. He had checked the gallows and the trapdoor where the villain falls through after the sentence is read, and the signal for the execution to begin, in advance, as required. Everything functioned precisely, like clockwork. John Lee appeared before a crowd of onlookers eager to see the murderer who had killed the elderly mistress of Glen Manor give up his soul to God. John prayed for the last time, remembering how Emma had taught him to do it, closing his eyes. The priest, standing on the scaffold not far from the gallows, also finished his ritual. When all the preparations were completed, a bag was put over John's head and a rope around his neck. He was led to the trapdoor and the executioner pulled the lever. The spectators, holding their breath, waited for the criminal's last whimper and the crunch of breaking vertebrae. But nothing happened. The trapdoor did not open. The executioner looked at the gallows in bewilderment, not understanding what was happening. As soon as John and the priest were led away from the trapdoor in the floor and asked to go downstairs, the structure opened. Everything was working fine. They decided to start the execution again. The butler was asked to say his last words. The bag was pulled over his head, the noose, and he was led to the trapdoor. The priest prayed again for the salvation of the soul of God's servant. The executioner pulled the lever, and again nothing happened. As soon as John Lee stood on the trapdoor, said goodbye to life, the gallows stopped working. The crowd began to cross themselves and whisper, The execution device was checked again for malfunctions, but the gallows were in order, and it seemed that nothing could prevent justice from being carried out. For the third time, John Lee was led to the scaffold. For the third time, he was prepared for execution. For the third time, he said goodbye to life and again remained unharmed. In the end, after the third failure, it was decided to cancel the execution. It was up to the judge to decide what to do with the prisoner who could not be hanged 3 times. Trying to execute John a 4th time would be inhumane. Therefore, the death sentence against him was commuted to life imprisonment, which lasted only 22 years. From prison, the unjustly convicted butler continued to write petitions to the judge to review the case due to his innocence, and on September 18, 1907, John Henry George Lee was finally released for good behavior. None of this made any sense until one day, 6 years after Emma Keyse's death, the bitter truth was revealed. More precisely, it became known much later. By that time, John was still serving his sentence in a prison cell, and everyone had long forgotten about him. In 1890, a group of people from high society, including politicians, lawyers, and other wealthy individuals, gathered at a cemetery near Glen Manor to say goodbye to a very important and respected man who had died after slowly going insane. When the priest finished the funeral rite, the mourners threw a few handfuls of earth into the grave and slowly began to disperse. Someone from the gathered whispered to another that perhaps today they had buried a criminal. Here is what, in the opinion of many, actually happened on the night of November 15, 1884, when Emma Keyse was brutally murdered. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you like this video. It's really important. Elizabeth's pregnancy, John Lee's sister, could have turned into a scandal not only for herself, but also for the father of her unborn child. He was also worried about his reputation and nervous about what society would think when they found out about his child out of wedlock, especially with someone else's maid. Only Elizabeth knew who this man was, but despite the threat of exposure, the father of the future baby did not want to give up his meetings with the pretty girl. He did not try to distance himself from Elizabeth in any way, but continued to sneak into her room when everyone was asleep. On that fateful night after the dinner party at Glen, which he also attended, the child's father decided to sneak into the manor under the cover of darkness to see his pregnant lover. Emma, the mistress of the estate, was still awake, although she had long since dismissed the servants. She was sitting in the living room, drinking cold cocoa and rereading old letters when she heard someone's cautious steps in the corridor. The woman put down the letter, placed the half-empty cup on the table, and went to see who was walking around at such a late hour. In the hallway, Emma came face to face with a man she had known for many years. He was coming out of the bedroom of the young cook, Elizabeth. Her religious and conservative nature could not tolerate such audacity. The woman instantly understood everything. She was so offended and angry that she started yelling at the night guest. The mistress threatened to tell the whole world about his escapades and illicit affair if he did not leave her house immediately and forget the way there, and then Emma approached the man and gave him a loud slap. At this moment, the face of the uninvited guest was distorted with malice. He snarled and flew into a rage. Instead of leaving, he started attacking Emma, and then grabbed an axe hanging on the wall near the pantry and brought it down right on the mistress's head. She collapsed to the floor as if cut down, but was still breathing and continued to silently gasp for air. Seeing the blood on his hands, the man came to his senses and realized what he had done. He understood that now his secret would be revealed. He would fall out of favor with society and lose his job. Even worse, he would go to jail for assaulting a person. Emma Keyse had to die to take his secret with her. In a moment of panic, the perpetrator ran to the kitchen, grabbed a knife, and finished his dirty work, finally knocking the spirit out of Emma Keyse. When she stopped showing signs of life, the man dragged her body back to the dining room where she usually read before bed. Then he doused the entire house with flammable oil, which was stored in the pantry where John slept, and started a fire to cover up the traces of the crime. The man didn't even notice the sleeping butler when he grabbed the oil from the shelf. Then the murderer ran out of the house, and for the next 6 years was tormented by the realization of the gravity of his wrongdoing. He suffered so much from having taken the life of his friend Emma Keyse that he almost sent Elizabeth and his unborn child to the next world as well. He began to go insane. Mental health problems led to a deterioration in his physical health. He stopped eating, getting up, recognizing his loved ones. As he lay on his deathbed, the man began to rave about things that had occupied his thoughts for the past 6 years. He spoke of the terrible death of a woman close to him who lived in a large, beautiful estate by the sea, of a fire that consumed the traces of the crime, of his child who was to be born. In essence, he confessed to the murder of Emma Keyse. His family and friends heard this, but it took them a while to connect the dying man's delirium with real events in his life. That's why people at his funeral were whispering, calling him a murderer. This man was none other than the lawyer Reginald Templar. Now no one will ever know whether he took on John Lee's case because he felt guilty and wanted to keep an innocent man out of prison, or whether he simply wanted to sabotage the case to have guarantees that he himself would not end up behind bars. Although it was during this trial that Reginald began to fall into the madness that ultimately led to his death. There are several different versions regarding John Lee's extraordinary escape from the gallows. Of course, the most religious and trusting people considered it divine intervention for wanting to hang an innocent man. God did not allow another crime to be committed, but this was nothing more than an illusion. There was another version related to God's providence. Only the Holy Father, who accompanied the criminal on the scaffold, unwittingly acted as the savior. When building the gallows, the carpenter accidentally broke one board. When pressure was applied to it, it blocked the latch mechanism, preventing it from working. When the priest ascended the scaffold during the execution and stood in his designated place, it created pressure on the broken board, and it jammed the entire structure. When testing the mechanism, the clergyman descended from the scaffold and the trapdoor opened freely. Thus, divine intervention consisted only in the fact that the Holy Father, without knowing it, was blocking the hatch. Another reason why the gallows malfunctioned every time John stood on the wooden doors was that when the scaffold was moved from one place to another, the drawbar was slightly displaced. As a result, the loops of the hatch got stuck when they were pressed by a weight. And there were several such versions. An alternative theory suggested that the trap was blocked by a wooden wedge that was inserted by an inmate working on the scaffold and removed when the device was tested. But confirmation of this theory was not found. Some said that John knew about the mistake of the carpenter who made the scaffold. If you stand on it in a certain way, the flaps will not open. Others argued that the wooden trap doors had swollen slightly from moisture. When someone stood on them, they would jam, but if there was no weight, they would open easily. Based on the story of the lawyer Reginald Templar, John was indeed an innocent man and did not deserve to die. Having spent 22 years in prison, John Lee became famous as a man who could not be hanged. After his release, the former prisoner even performed in public several times, telling about his life. A silent film was made about his divine salvation from the gallows. A book was written about this incredible case, and even a rock opera was created where the main character miraculously avoids being hanged 3 times. Information about John Lee's whereabouts after 1916 varies slightly in different sources. There is documentary evidence that after his release from prison, John Lee married and emigrated to America, where he lived a happy and peaceful life until he died at the age of 81. The case, where thanks to some amazing coincidence, a person sentenced to death was able to stay alive, has gone down in the history of the crime genre. This is the end of the story. Like the video and leave your thoughts in the comments. This was Jeremy. See you soon.